sorry to be a little late.
No problem. We are also late, so we're all on the same page. Don't worry, Maria.
Perfect.
We will ask you for 1 or 2 more minutes as people are entering the room, so we don't have too much background noise. Okay, and then we will start. So just in a few moments.
Yeah.
So welcome to our first webinar of the tracking project. Just a few words about our project. The tracking project is funded by the EA Norway grants through the Youth Employment Fund. And our project focuses on the effectiveness of public employment services support on the future of rural needs. So we're looking at several levels and several layers of the intervention of public employment services, whether it's policies, programs, and best practices, and also the impact of the services on young people in this condition. So as part of our project, we have a webinar series, and this is our first webinar. We will be focusing today on digitalization and employment. And we have the great honor and the great pleasure to have with us Maria Prieto, who will share some thoughts based on a report that was recently published by the International Labour Organization, which is a partner of our project on this topic. I will shortly introduce Maria before she makes her presentation. So Maria Prieto works as an employment and future of work specialist. She is currently working at the Employment Policy Department of ILO. In her current position, she works on the 2 interrelated strategic topics of youth employment and digitalization. Maria coordinates the implementation of ILO's governing body approved by the Youth Employment Action Plan 2020-2030. As well as she is also leading the work on digitalization in the context of national employment policies. Previously, Maria worked as a specialist in ILO's Future of Work initiative, where she provided technical support to the Global Commission on the Future of Work. And she has also more than 18 years of experience and professional experience in the United Nations in positions that include thematic areas such as youth employment, digitalization, local economy and social development, public-private partnerships for urban environment, small and micro enterprises, informal economy, and infrastructure development. So, Maria, please feel welcome to our group and to our project, and please move along with your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to see you over in a small screen. Let me know if you can't hear me, or if there is anything. I don't really see you because I see you in a very small screen. So just gesture, and I will then stop talking. And
it's okay. We can listen to you perfectly. Okay,
great. That's fantastic. So yes, I've been asked to present the work of the ILO on digitalization and employment. And indeed, there was a publication a year or so ago that we worked on that I will include in my presentation. But I just wanted to give you the context of the organization's work in this area of work. And for currently, there has been a decision that the International Labour Conference will discuss the issue of platforms in 2025. And this is a very big change, a decision, because it will lead the discussion into a standard setting discussion, that is international regulations, that is quite new. And it is in the context of technological change and coming from the discussion on in the Future of Work Commission, the ILO Centenary Declaration on the Future of Work, the work on platform, etc., that here in the ILO, we're working to develop knowledge that would support that discussion, and that would support the giving advice and recommendations to our tripartite constituents. So the report as such, that is called Digitalization and Employment, a review, is more of a, it started off like we wanted to do a literature review, and then it sort of evolved into something different because there was a need to go beyond the mere what's written, but look at different things, what's going on, what are the gaps, what are the policy issues, etc. So it went towards a more of a examination on the effect on the labor market of digital transformation in general, and looked also at political and policy implications. There are many, but they are not always hand in hand with the employment policies. But for example, in most countries of the OECD, there is a digital strategy that is not with the Ministry of Labor. So there were findings like that, now positions the ILO to see how we can better recommend around those issues. We also looked into some statistics and regional differences and the differences between the digital economy and digital labor, who the employers are in the digital economy. It is not only the platforms as such, but it is much, much broader. It goes in through a lot of sectors, and we found a bit of a complicated an extremely vast area to navigate. It was a little bit compared to when the ILO started or was strengthening its work, like something like 40 years ago or more, on the informal economy, like going into that economy and seeing what's going on, what are the issues, etc. Doing something similar for the digital economy it's extremely vast. So we had to be very pragmatic and to limit the areas that we addressed. So to identify the workers were, of course, one of the issues, and to identify the employers, another one, us being the ILO. And in the report, you will see that there are some highlights or some some topics that pop out that as a result from our queries and discussion with colleagues and reviews of literature, etc. And one of these areas is employment relations, of course, social protection, collective bargaining and social dialogue, everything that's association, entrepreneurship, the issue of COVID's impact on remote work, the skills, the effect on quality of work, and also the inclusion, exclusion of certain populations. So jumping directly into the issue of employment relations and digitalization. Now, digitalization does provide something that is fantastic for many, and that is flexibility. No, I mean, this is something that we all appreciate, and in particular in different periods of life as such. But it doesn't take into consideration, we don't take into consideration always that there is an excluding part of the flexibility, but that is something different. So another issue is that given that digitalization provides for a different variety of formats of work, now the relationship between employer and employee, worker, it becomes blurred. And that brings a lot of issues. So there's a lot of literature, a lot of work around getting around this blurriness. And obviously it's directly related to national law. So it is very much related to the situation in the country, the historic evolution of employment and self-employment, etc., and the regulations in place. So when we first started the discussion years ago about the digitalization of work and workers, etc., the first issue that we were looking at was, who is the worker and who is the employer? And obviously, this is something that we're still trying to get our heads around. And in our structure, ILO tripartite structure with the employers and workers' organizations and governments, to have clarity on who's who is important in the negotiations, particularly collective bargaining and so forth. Now, this so-called gigification of jobs accelerated during COVID because life changed, as we know, and this is important to take into consideration. It is also important that most developed economies are trying to use the existing regulatory frameworks to include, to facilitate the inclusion of workers in the digital economy, and some are more successful than others. And then there is the issue of cross-border work. So there the national legislation becomes a challenge, which is why it would be so important to have some international standard setting mechanism that could support those workers in cross-border relationships. Now, another issue, obviously, that we came across was social protection, and social protection being one of the pillars of the decent work agenda of the ILO. And social protection is regarded as a universal human right. However, normally it is provided through formal mechanisms or formal employment relationships. So if even in the informal economy, this is of course an issue, but in some digital workers contract, there or lack thereof, there is an option to opt from having any protection. And so that is one of the realities that we're facing. So all these alternative work arrangements are difficult to develop some kind of labor protection and legislation around. What I mentioned earlier, collective bargaining and social dialogue, of course, this is very close to the ILO's heart. Freedom of association is one of the fundamental rights that the organization stresses. And it is a very big and important instrument for inclusion, no? And for preserving quality of work and so on. However, before, the workers were in groups, in factories, in shops, etc., etc. Now the individualization of the worker makes it a little hard for this association to take place in an organic way. And also geographic exclusion is, or geographic disconnection is also an issue. So again, it means that the employer-employee relationship is not longer the same. So mechanisms are different, and the mechanisms are not yet clear for how that will happen, collective bargaining, for example. And obviously it's not only collective bargaining, but also other regulations that need to be respected and that are sometimes difficult to adhere to. Another important issue is digital entrepreneurship. And to get the picture of who the creation of employment in the digital economy is a huge opportunity for many people around the world, and to address the destruction of some occupations and jobs, to see how, so obviously, like always, the ILO is a fine balance between challenges and opportunities, the creation of work and the creation of quality work, employers and workers. That issue is, of course, an important aspect that we looked into. And also the fact that there is no digital sector. There is digitalization, it's in every sector. Even platform work as such doesn't have a specific sector. We can say there are more in some than others, in transport, in delivery, etc. But it is something that the economy is going through and transforming it along the way. So employment and everything that goes around employment has to follow that transformation. One issue is digital infrastructure that we sometimes forget, well, not forget, but don't consider in terms of access to the technology, access to jobs, and the inequality between regions and globally that this leads to. So there is a fear of, or a reality of, an increased inequality between rich and poor regions because of this lack of digital infrastructure. Another issue that was highlighted was the remote work that we also explode during the pandemic. So it is estimated that we sort of accelerated several years during these lockdowns, and it was also became part of the mentality of work that wasn't there before. It became the telework or the working from another region or another country, another location became a normal. And now there is also the hybrid work model that is developing, and the amount of flexibility that is created around remote work that also has implication, obviously, on regulations. And I believe we all have seen that in all the countries. When you work in one country and work in another, you know, if, for example, here in Switzerland, France being very close, there are certain rules that apply that are different. Skills is always obviously a huge area that has to be taken into consideration, and the issue of lifelong learning and the necessity to include that in policy, hand in hand with employment policy, was something that was started to discuss years ago, and that is becoming more and more important, in particular the creation of opportunities through digitalization of implementing lifelong learning. To meet this new nature of work, if you like, no? But the lockdown has also seen a skills gap more apparent. There are some studies around that. So it is the isolation and the cutting of educations and trainings, etc., did lead to a number of negative impact on people's access to labor later on. One of the main things that we are all faced with, and not only in our work, but ourselves, is the job quality in reference to digitalization. And this is something that comes back again and again. So flexibility, as I mentioned before, is fantastic for many, but one tends to ignore the exclusion of access to decent work. That is, unfortunately, sometimes one of the outcomes because of the working relationship, etc., and I mentioned earlier. So there is the two sides of the coin that had to be taken into consideration. So also the conditions, obviously the conditions of work and the quality of work, they vary from region to region, country to country, and so on. But digitally, workers are sometimes competing globally. So it gives another picture to the labor market, or another dimension. And digital exclusion has unfortunately become common. And there is also the issue of discrimination. Some years ago, we were talking about discriminating logarithms that discriminated on the ethnicity and race and gender and so on, and not maybe not by explicitly, but as part of the programming. And this is something that has been addressed in many occasions and in many logarithms. However, it is not so easy to overcome. Another job quality issue that we saw again and again in this study was the issue of stress, anxiety, etc., related to digitalization. You know, the constant connectivity that makes provides stress, so in some countries the discussion and the debate around rights to disconnect, like for example in France, are now also being discussed by companies at company level and also at government level. I also wanted to say something about, exclusion from the labor market is, not something new that comes with digitalization. Exclusion has always been there, and it can be on the basis of a number of gender, race, age, social class, and many other reasons. Now, with digitalization, it gives it another dimension, no? So although some do profit from it, and regardless of gender and age and so forth, there are some that are excluded because of access to infrastructure, to skills, and so on. And young people in particular, it was noted in particular during the COVID that they were very much affected by the pandemic because they were the ones that were victims of triple shock. You must have maybe talked about it, maybe with Niels and others, about how the shocks to entering the labor market, remaining in the labor market, and shocks to education gave the new generations coming in a really bad deal during COVID. Although young people are labeled to be very digital, there's not only, there are other skills that are needed that might not be in their repertoire. And obviously there are many other groups that are excluded, like migrants or irregular migrants and refugees, etc., and people with disabilities. There are, digitalization should be a way to accommodate, to give reasonable accommodations for disabled people, for example. But obviously for that, there needs to be connectivity, training, and so forth. Now, the report, and this is what I wanted to finalize the presentation of the report with, identify a number of challenges that you must have guessed during my presentation. One of the challenges were for the businesses competing in the digital space. There are many say that it's not an easy space, and we realized that we had very little information about who this new digital employers were. which is why we started recently rolling out a survey to digital platforms to ask them about what their challenges were and in relation to how they approach the labor market. And we're hoping to get some answers that we still don't have. Now, another obvious challenge is the global inequalities and the not only the infrastructure, but the skills inequality that leads to these global inequalities. The cross-border remote working is both obviously a challenge and an opportunity. No, we have seen a lot of workers from the global south be employed through platforms in the north, in the global north, or across borders. So it does create opportunities where there were none before. No, and although the quality of jobs, the regulations and so forth are difficult to implement cross-border, as there is little guidance at this moment. There is, however, the creation of this employment or this work that has to be taken into consideration. The blurring of the employment relationship is one that has been a major challenge for the ILO and its constituents. The skills gaps, also the access to workers' rights, what those rights are and well defined, and well, we know what the workers' rights are because we have all the other norms and regulations, etc., of the ILO. But in the global digital economy, it is difficult to implement those rights, and that is the issue, including for collective bargaining. And obviously inequality in the digital economy, what I mentioned on the different groups, gender, youth, but other vulnerable groups that should be taken into consideration when developing employment policies and in connection to other digital policies. And there is a need here for greater policy coherence at national level, but also at international level. So I will leave it at that because I think that sort of brings all my worries to the table. So if you have any questions, anything that you want me to strengthen or to develop further, please let me know. I will stop sharing. Just one second.
Thank you, Maria. I think you offered a very comprehensive overview of the report, both of the highlights, but also the gaps. We will have now a Q&A session, a short one, of about 20 minutes. I would add two questions to kind of start the discussions. And the first one, given the focus of our project, has to do with the intersection of your results with the role of public employment services. So something that I would like you to address is, even if it is only in a speculative way or trying to guess a bit what are the intersections, is how public employment services need to adjust their role considering the results of your report. So as a starter, I think that's something that we would like to hear your thoughts. And secondly, there is this huge narrative about how digitalization can represent an opportunity for the rural labor markets, for working from rural areas. Even this morning, we were talking about how the future of work can affect rural youth perspectives, and how this can shape their expectations in terms of the future work. So what I would like to ask you is, if this is really true, if the digitalization is providing new opportunities for all jobs, or if this is a myth, or if this is something in between, and this is a bit more nuanced with pros and cons associated with digitalization, and of course the future prospects of rural work. So if we could start from here, and then of course other questions are welcome.
Okay, great. To start, let me, there is like an ongoing, remember a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about destruction of work. Well, how many millions of jobs we will lose here and gain there. You know, that was a lot of, the discussion was a lot on numbers and jobs being destroyed and not being destroyed. So one of the issues that was established fairly quickly, it was that it's not that the destruction of jobs, it's more the transformation of them, so which is where the skilling part becomes, or reskilling and upskilling and so forth, becomes very important. So, but that doesn't say that there is no destruction, because there is some destruction of certain occupations more than jobs as such, or tasks. So there, I think this is something that we have to take into consideration, and in particular, because some time ago, when automation came into the labor market, everybody was scared that it would take away the work from the factories, etc., and so forth. Now, that didn't really happen that way, because the automation needed the machines and the people to work on them and so forth. Now, digitalization is quite similar, and particular artificial intelligence. Now, what we can safely say is that almost all occupations and all jobs have been transformed. Like how we are working now. I mean, I'm sitting here, this is not something that we did a few years ago. And although we had the possibility of doing it, it wasn't in our mentality to do so. So this has transformed my job. So that is one thing important to consider. Now, how this affects employment services, well, I'm sure that Sulum must have explained a little bit about the digitalization of employment services, so I won't get into that. But it does, the role of the employment services as such, I don't think changes. But as with everything else, it becomes more dynamic and need of more flexibility to understand what's going on constantly in the labor market. And this is a huge task to do. And obviously, depending on the country and situation, that capacity is maybe not there. So I would say that more the role, it's the way the services are provided. And obviously, people are now applying for jobs through other means, increasingly through social media, etc. So that connection, so that private-public connection becomes, I think, more important. When it comes to work from the rural areas, as with cross-border work and so forth, it does, in principle, it does increase the opportunities that were not there before, but it also increases the competition between the labor force, because the labor force that was then before seen as something in a city, it's now a global labor force. And this is something to be taken into consideration. If you are sitting in a rural area, yes, you can access work through a platform, and which is great. But you are also competing with everybody. And many use these labor platforms as one way to create employment. In rural areas, this can also be the case because of the seasonality of work in rural areas, etc. It can provide an alternative or a fill to the jobs available in the rural region. So I would say, yes, it's true that it's always new opportunities. There are also new challenges in terms of all the challenges that I just mentioned, social protection included. So I think we should always look at this, at the digitalization of employment and digitalization of jobs from both sides, from the demand and supply, from the opportunities and the challenges. And if you are working as a clerk, for example, this is one occupation that more or less is disappearing with time. The issue of reskilling or re-entering the labor market and the employment service in supporting those kinds of transitions would be a new important role for the, maybe not new, but an important role for the employment services in the current climate.
Thank you, Maria, for your insights on these two topics. I will open the discussion to other people online and in the room. So I think we have time to 2 or 3 more questions. So I don't know if there's any question online or here from the tracking team. Any other question, curiosity? Online? No. Okay, so I think it's clear enough how we can or we should integrate these new challenges coming in from the digitalization side. And actually, one of our focuses is how digitalization is also affecting and transforming services provision. I would add a last question regarding that specific topic. I'd like to know, Maria, if by any chance you did find any evidence or any data on most promising professional pathways that include the digitalization side, and that may be professional areas that are more promising for all areas. We had this discussion this morning. So are there out there any trends that you see that have the potential to be promising for young people in rural areas?
Yes. Well, the recommendation there is three. There are three areas. One is in context of greening the economy. Another one is on the care economy, also both possibilities in rural areas. And the third one that has been sort of circling around a lot is in the area of creativity. Where there are some possibilities, and where young people and with their digital savvy than others can see that potential more than the adult counterparts. So those are, I think, three of the, I'm sure there are other examples, but in particular when it comes to rural areas. And there is, and also in the report, we mentioned going from unpaid to paid work through the internet, or I don't know how to call it, because there are ways of doing paid work, different types of paid work. You will, if you look at it, you will see it. And these were things that I was personally not aware of when we did this study, and it was the consultants that one from China that was very good at seeing, you know, how this could be done. And a lot of this sort of very gig work, like short work, is done by young people and sitting in remote areas because all you need is a phone. So it's more as clicks or things like that. But greening, for example, it's something that requires more skilling, yeah, and care in work, going from unpaid to paid work is something that the ILO is putting a lot of its efforts to promote.
Okay, Maria, thank you. So I think we have achieved our goal, which was to see how the main highlights of your reports intersect with our work and how they can inspire our future research as we are heading to the final stage of our research project. So thank you very much for joining us. And we will for sure use in a very focused and interested way your report in our work, in our research. And we hope that in the future we can again share with you the results of our own.
Yes, please.
So thank you
It
for.
would be nice.
And we soon have a second webinar by mid-October. And we will be joining a series of projects from the Youth Employment Fund to discuss on the rural aspects of their interventions. So thank you very much for joining us, Maria, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.